Hello, I'm Catherine Kerrison, Professor of History at Villanova University and author of Jefferson's Daughters, Three Sisters, White and Black in a Young America. I'd like to thank Dr. Jeffrey Ludwig and the Seward House Museum for this opportunity to speak with you today. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about my efforts to recover the lost history of Thomas Jefferson's daughter, Harriet Hemings, then relate that project with the Seward House Museum's work on the stories of Harriet Tubman and Margaret Stewart, and last, then conclude by addressing the wider significance of the struggle to recover lost histories from archives designed to keep those histories hidden. The departure of Harriet Hemings from Monticello in 1822 caused quite a stir in the little town of Charlottesville. There was a great deal of talk about it. Edmund Bacon, Jefferson's overseer, remembered. People said he freed her because she was his own daughter, unquote. From the courthouse square seen here, so right sort of between those buildings, the people of Charlottesville could easily see Jefferson's home atop his little mountain. Over whiskey or peach brandy in Charlottesville's Swan Tavern or the Eagle Hotel, Jefferson's neighbors had freely discussed, among themselves and with snooping strangers, his relations with Sally Hemings and the children who looked so much like him. Now, jaws agape, they animatedly sought to explain why Jefferson would free Harriet Hemings. Everyone knew, as Jefferson himself had once said, that, quote, a slave woman who brings a child every 2 years is more profitable than the best man on the farm, unquote. That would explain why Jefferson had never done such a thing before. Frustratingly, we don't know the details of Harriet Hemings' departure, nor can we know what she was feeling the day she left. And although Bacon put her on a stagecoach to Philadelphia, we can't even be sure that's where she went. She would resurface briefly when her brother Madison told her story to an Ohio newspaper 51 years later. Even then, the details remained sketchy and, for all we know, very much calculated to mislead anyone trying to follow her historical tracks. The momentous events of the spring and summer of 2020 have prompted us to think about the problem of the erasure of some histories in favor of others, to recognize the importance of trying to recapture lost stories despite the difficulties posed by a dearth of evidence, and to come to an honest reckoning with the racialized society that Europeans built from their very first arrival in the Americas and that we all continue to live with today. So let me tell you what we do know about Harriet Hemings. She was the second of 4 surviving children of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. She had 3 brothers, Beverly, Madison, and Eston. Her father's farm book, and here is a page, shows that she was born in May 1801. You can see I've marked that with the red arrow. Another entry in 1815 lists her among the 12 people at work in his textile manufactory on Mulberry Row, which is just down the kitchen path from Jefferson's home. We know that at Jefferson's directive, Bacon paid the fare to Philadelphia and supplied Harriet with $50 for her travel expenses. We have no other records from Jefferson or his descendants about Harriet. Their complicity with his silence dropped a veil around his shadow family that, as one historian has aptly observed, has taken almost 2 centuries to lift. From her brother Madison's account, we learned that Harriet Hemings, quote, married a white man in good standing in Washington City and raised a family of children, unquote. And we can safely deduce that Harriet Hemings lived until at least 1863, for in 1873, when Madison was telling her story, he said that he hadn't heard from her in about 10 years. But during all those years, he said, he was, quote, not aware that her identity as Harriet Hemings of Monticello has ever been discovered, unquote. So, guided by Madison's words, I focused my search for his sister in the Washington area, the District of Columbia, Alexandria, Virginia, and Maryland. Those of you who have read my book know that I began by imagining Harriet Hemings arriving in the national capital, stepping out of the coach onto the packed dirt of Pennsylvania Avenue. I often wondered what her thoughts were when she looked down that avenue and first saw the presidential mansion, sketched here in 1800, into which her father had just moved when she, his enslaved child, was born. Or as she first climbed Capitol Hill and saw the city below her that he helped to design. This is actually an image done in 1824. Notice Pennsylvania Avenue lined with the poplar trees that Harriet's father planted during his administration. She certainly knew the difference between free and unfree, and who got to enjoy the privileges of freedom that Washington, D.C. was meant to embody and celebrate, and who did not. How would she now go about claiming the rights that her father had so eloquently declared universal, but clearly meant for whites only? And how would I go about looking for a woman intent on erasing her historical tracks? Since she did not take the Hemings name into freedom, I started with the hope that perhaps Harriet might have had a son to whom she gave one of her brother's very distinctive names, Beverly, Madison, or Eston, as a way that perhaps I could identify her. I quickly learned, however, that the District of Columbia didn't even start keeping birth records until 1874. However, the district did begin keeping marriage records in 1811. So I pulled the names of every Harriet who married between 1822 and 1830, and that produced a list of 58 Harriets and, even better, 58 husbands to research. And assembling all the clues that I had from Monticello's records, from Madison's stories, I went to work, using a process of elimination to see if I could identify her. I read through the 1850 federal census, which was the first to list the name, sex, age, and occupation of every member of the household. I read all the city directories, which helped me, as you can see from this list here, helped me to place husbands on the landscape, where in the city they live, to identify their trade. Note here, for example, James Monroe, trade, President of the United States, who'd be found at the President's house, not to be confused with the James Monroe who is the engineer at Dyer's Steam Mill. I looked at newspapers which supplied other information in wedding announcements and obituaries. Wills also helped me to identify family members, as did church records for baptisms, weddings, and funerals. I even tracked down one descendant who very generously allowed me to look at her marvelous 19th century family Bible. As I learned about life in 19th century Washington, and here we see an 1833 view. You can see the Capitol on the right, the White House over on the left, slightly enlarged for the purposes, I think, of balancing Washington's portrait. But as I learned about life in antebellum Washington, I thought a great deal about the life Harriet would have created there. And I came to understand that if she wanted a life different from her mother's, she had to leave Charlottesville. And if she wanted a better life in antebellum America, she had to pass as a freeborn white woman. Her options were different from those of her brothers, who were trained in crafts that enabled them to marry and support families. But as a beautiful, young, white-presenting woman, Harriet's best route to financial security and respectability was to marry up into a family of good standing, as Madison had said, in a growing city where no one knew of her enslaved origins. Less than 10 years after she left Monticello, her younger brothers would marry free women of color in their old neighborhood, continuing the process to free the next generation of Hemingses. But to ensure freedom for her children, Harriet had to leave Charlottesville and her enslaved origins behind forever. Because you see, Jefferson never formally freed her. And so by Virginia law, Harriet's children inherited their mother's enslaved status. And of course, even in the so-called free states, federal fugitive slave laws supported those laws in the southern states, in every state of the Union. So these racist structures explained Harriet's determination to disappear from history and from her famous connections. And that, along with the silence of the white archives, explains the near impossibility of learning more about her life. The Seward House Museum has a case that presents similar challenges to anyone trying to fill out the stories of two Black women, at least one of whom was born into slavery, and who were also associated with a prominent family. After the Civil War, William Seward famously sold land and a home in Auburn to settle Harriet Tubman in safety and security for the rest of her life. Yet there's this curious near silence in both his official and personal papers about her and her significance in their town and in their country. Similarly, we know little about Margaret Stewart, who at age 10 was brought here to the Seward home by Harriet Tubman. William's wife, Frances, took the little girl into the Seward family circle and raised her alongside her own daughter, Fanny. But as an exhibit in the museum points out, quote, "The remarkable life of Margaret Stewart is more than a reflection or culmination of that unique relationship shared between the Tubman and the Seward families. It's meaningful in its own right. From the early foundation on both sides of South Street, Margaret built a home and a family for herself in Auburn," unquote. And yet that story, which remains shrouded in mystery, in part because of the silence of the Seward archives, also has yet to be fully written. It's tragic that we've lost the stories of these women and countless millions of others. Our understanding of our history as Americans would be so much better and richer for their inclusion. But that loss goes deeper than just sort of the lack of individual accounts. The work of doing history is much more complex than simply compiling stories and adding them to the ones we already know and celebrate. No, these silences in the historical record reflect the power at work in the very creation of the archives themselves. Who are the people worth remembering? What historical records are worth keeping? And note here on Jefferson's gravestone, he himself determined the words that were going to be literally carved in stone of his accomplishments. But what of his enslaved workforce? Here's Isaac Granger Jefferson, blacksmith on the left, and his enslaved children on the right. If you look very closely, you can see Harriet's name listed rather innocuously among the factory workers in Jefferson's farm book. There's nothing there to give away her relationship to him. How do we tell their stories? The violence of this process occurs countless times and is compounded over the course of centuries during the subject's own lifetime in decisions about what is worth keeping and the archive that will house them. in the stories that are erased versus those that will be told as historical narratives are produced decade after decade to our own day. And finally, the ways that these stories then powerfully shape the societal arrangements with which we continue to live. Neither Tubman nor Stewart really register in the Seward family correspondence, nor does Harriet Hemings in the Jefferson family papers. Certainly in the case of the Hemings family, this omission was deliberate and calculated to protect a mythology around Jefferson. So the silences of the archives force us to consider the ways that people in positions of power and privilege have lionized accomplishments they claim for themselves, but which have rested on the talents, labor, courage, and endurance of those they exploited. They force us to consider how a history sanitized of slavery, racism, and innumerable other structures of patriarchy has not only denied millions of people their history, but has falsely valorized a narrative of white supremacy. In 2020, Americans are increasingly confronting these hard truths. My ongoing search for Harriet Hemings, as well as that of the Seward House Museum for the fullness of Harriet Tubman's and Margaret Stewart's stories, are efforts to address that imbalance. I take heart from the fact that so long relegated to the bottom of the American social strata, Black women's stories are showing us the way. Thank you for joining me today and for your interest in these stories. Goodbye.